It's time to tune in to Defending the Faith with Frank Harber. Hear the latest about religious liberty.
A win for religious freedom in one of the remaining blockbuster cases facing the U.S. Supreme Court this term.
A legal battle continues for the Little Sisters of the Poor for nearly a decade now.
A street preacher armed with a speaker, a microphone, and a camera strapped to his chest is now banned from the village.
Our founding fathers believed in the separation of church and state, but not for one fleeting moment did they believe in the separation of God and government.
And powerful apologetics. Are you prepared to defend the faith?
I'm convinced unless we trust in God, this nation is finished.
We're facing a new kind of enemy. We're involved in a new kind of warfare, and we need the help of the Spirit of God.
3, 2, 1.
Welcome to another episode of Defending the Faith, and I am Frank Harber. I am your host. I am the President and Chief Legal Counsel for the Institute for Christian Defense. If you've never heard of us before, you can find us online at defendingthefaith.law. We're an interesting nonprofit ministry because we do both legal work and we also do theological work. We defend the faith. You know, for 21 years of my life, I was an atheist. I tried to prove that there was not a God, ended up converting to Christianity, and I've spent the rest of my life helping people understand why Christianity is the truth. But I'm also a lawyer, and we defend Christianity in the legal arena. And we've got cases going full blast right now in Kentucky. We have a new case involving gender X in the state of Alabama. We've got all kinds of things. There's all kinds of challenges to the faith in the world that we have today. I am so excited about today's show because, you know, the more and more evidence that we find in science, the real evidence of science doesn't lead us away from God, but it leads us to God. And the guest that we have on today is Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. And this guy is smart. I mean, he is a brain. You're going to hear about his credentials in a second. I mean, this guy has it. Where he works is just incredible. But he has a new book out. We're going to talk about this book in just a second. But this book is called Traced. And I must tell you that I've seen a lot of books in my time. This book is absolutely special. And, the subtitle of this is called Human DNA's Big Surprise. And let me tell you, there is a surprise indeed. And this is a great faith builder for knowing that there is a God, for knowing that the Bible is true. And we're going to get into that in just a second, but we want to welcome to the show for the first time, and hopefully not the last time, Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. And how are you, good doctor?
Thank you so much for having me, Frank, and I apologize in advance to our audience. I've been fighting this sinus bug, so though my voice might be weak, hopefully the words are more powerful in the book than they might come across today.
And he did offer today to postpone the show because he is a little under the weather. But I mean, I didn't want to postpone because I'm so excited about this show. I am so excited about this guy that we have on today. He's absolutely incredible. I've heard him speak, and you're going to be blown away. And I have not overhyped this show. So, Doctor, tell us about your background. Tell us who you are, and then we're going to get into this because it's just fascinating.
Yeah, I grew up in a Christian home. My parents were both professed believers and faithful church attenders. They were both in the medical field originally. My mother was a nurse until she had me. I'm the firstborn. Then she was a homemaker and a homeschooler for her children. I have a brother and a sister who's 16 years younger. And I grew up in the homeschool movement with a strong background. I grew up in Wisconsin, where my parents were, in a sense, at the ground level at that time. I went to a small Christian high school. We probably would have done homeschool through 12th grade, except again at that time, so this would have been the mid to late 90s. There was still some concern about what would colleges say if you graduated from a homeschool academy. So they wanted to make sure we had something legit. There were 3 Christian school options in the area. Only one of the Christian schools would take a strong stand on Genesis. That was the one my parents picked. Now, I should add as well, I had grown up with having attended worldview conferences, and there was a strong apologetic background, I'd say, in my home. And I forgot to mention, my dad was a dentist, so there was that science element as well that I grew up with. So when I went off to secular college, the University of Wisconsin Parkside, I had this firm apologetic scriptural foundation where there was little that took me by surprise. That's not to say that I was this smart kid as much as I feel like the training worked. I could take the questions to my professors instead of have them blindside me in class. And another thing that I can look back and say was a great benefit was that I was able to live at home. I lived on campus one summer, and the amount of, for lack of a better term, debauchery that happens is something I'm glad I was able to avoid for much of my time there. I went to graduate school at Harvard for my Ph.D. in Boston. So there, I'm obviously not living at home, but I was able to find Christian roommates, or there was a strong student-focused church I attended, young adult perhaps, where one of the ministries was helping young people like myself find other Christian housemates. I was single at the time. So all that, I think, was a huge influence in surviving. I think that's a good term when you go off to secular college, surviving both undergraduate and graduate school with faith intact and creationism intact. And then I joined the Institute for Creation Research in 2009, right after I graduated. So I graduated in June of 2009 from Harvard with a PhD, joined in September of 2009 at the Institute for Creation Research, was tasked with developing the biological research program in creation science, which is what I did for 6 years there. Then joined the Institute for Creation Research I joined Answers in Genesis from the Institute for Creation Research in 2015, where I've continued the research. And in a sense, we've just been following the evidence wherever it led, wherever the data has been. And there happens to have been a lot of human DNA data. And so that's really in a nutshell what's led up to this latest book, Traced, which looks at the genetics of human history.
So just to give our listeners maybe an intro here, would it be an understatement to say that if someone got the correct genetic test, that you could trace their ancestry back to one of Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, or Japheth? Is that accurate?
That's one of the big surprises. The publisher put human DNA is big surprise, singular, which is true. You can kind of boil it down to one thing, but there's so many surprises, and that's one of them. If you're a male and you take a Y chromosome test, so the Y chromosome is the male inherited DNA, and the reason we're doing this is for technical reasons that would take a while to get into, but just sort of the way the world is right now. If you get a Y chromosome test, you find out which branch you belong to. You can email that to me, or you get the book. It has a table at the back, or at one of the last color plates in the book is a 4-page table saying, if this is your result, this is your son of Noah, this is your history. And just as a side note, it's not just that we can go back to a son of Noah, but you can take my DNA. So I've done my Y chromosome test. My last name, Jeanson, I've learned is a French derivation. Satisfyingly, my Y chromosome test takes me back to France a couple hundred years ago. But before that, one of the surprises is that it takes me back, like so many Western Europeans, to Central Asia in the Middle Ages. And those people were connected to the ancient Scythians. And then you can go on back. You can go basically from A to Z or Z to A, whichever way you're looking at it. And not just to every son of Noah, but the messy interconnected history in between all that. That's been one of the big surprises for me, looking at the history of civilization. What happens to civilizations when they fall? Well, the people become the people of the next civilization. And to see that sort of interconnectedness has been just wild for me. But yes, and I'll put on a website here, because this has been one of the primary ways I've been able to communicate with people. If you get the book, it'll be in Appendix A, but if not, you don't even have to get the book. You go to DNA test result. I've had many people write in and ask about this, and I can look this up in 10 seconds and give them the answer. If you go to answersingenesis.org, which is our homepage, and you type in /go/traced, which is the title of the book, that'll take you to a page where if you scroll down, you can enter your name, email address, question, and we've probably had several hundred now. I've got a folder of probably 1,000 emails which is all the back and forth as well. But people have written in saying either I want to participate in future DNA research. I like what you're doing because this is just the beginning of the research we're doing. This will probably last me the rest of my life. And there are other sons or other descendants of Noah listed in Genesis 10 for which we do not yet have their lineage detected. We'll probably find it. But anyone who has a DNA test or they want to participate in future research, answersingenesis.org/go/traced, or you get it in the book as well. You can look up the last table there, and it'll tell you exactly which son of Noah you have. And I should add, if you're a lady, it's not like you're left out of this. Men have the same problem to deal with as well. What about my mother's side? Where does my mother's side come from? What son of Noah, what family of Noah does she come from? Well, if you get a male relative, and we've done this, so both on my side and my wife's side. On my side, my mother's brother, we've had his Y chromosome tested. We can take it back to a son of Noah. One of the things I was interested in is, and we could talk about this in a few minutes probably, there's a 95% chance you and me, Frank, and you and anyone listening have the same common ancestor just 600 years ago. And so I was curious how close my mother's side and my dad's side were, as well as my wife's side and my side. So we've had a number of her relatives tested, her father, her mother's brother. You can knock yourself out going crazy with this, all the various branches of your family tree. But the key element is the Y chromosome, the male inherited DNA, and a number of public companies will do that.
So I've done a regular DNA test, 23andMe, and then I've also done the ancestry.com tree. In fact, I believe it's my 23rd great grandfather is Robert the Bruce. So gave Braveheart a whole new meaning to me. But okay, so this Y chromosome test, is it the same as the 23andMe test?
For 23andMe, the answer is probably yes. This is something I learned from the many people who've written in. If you go to ancestry.com, I think the only thing they offer right now is a DNA test of the DNA you inherit from both parents, which, okay, then you get both sides. The drawback of this test is, or perhaps I should say the dirty little secret, is it only goes back a few generations. I'm 50% genetically each of my parents, who are 50% of their parents. I'm 25% each of my grandparents, 12.5 great-grandparents, 6.25% great-great-parents, whatever it is. The genetic signal drops off very quickly with that type of DNA, and so you probably don't learn more than you already know from your family tree. That's the dirty little secret. Now, 23andMe doesn't make the Y chromosome aspect of their test terribly transparent. If you dig, you can kind of see it. I've discovered, because so many people have written in, that 23andMe, if you just do their standard genetic test, that's usually part of the equation. So they'll tell you the DNA from both parents. They'll tell you the Y chromosome. They'll probably also throw in the female inherited DNA, or the DNA you get only from mom, the mitochondrial DNA. So what I've learned, I guess, over the past several weeks of people writing in is it looks like the best bang for your buck, so to speak, is this 23andMe test. I've been impressed with the level of detail they have in the Y chromosome, so that you can tease out a lot of the fine elements of someone's history. I had been sending people to Family Tree DNA. We had used that for my uncle as well as for Ken Ham, but because they offer standalone Y chromosome tests. But the level of detail they report for the same price seems to be a lot less. So I've been sending people to 23andMe because you get a whole lot of information for a fairly decent price.
So I was watching online when you did the big reveal, which one of the sons of Noah that Ken Ham came from. Was he surprised?
I kept it a secret from him. I'd say he's sometimes hard to read. I was trying to figure out how he might respond. And that's kind of why I tried to lead him into it to see what he would say. And he was saying, well, Australian, which is basically British ancestry, you'd think, well, these are Japhetic in origin, which early on I'd say yes. And there still is Japhetic ancestry in Europe. It just tends to be the minority because for some reason you've had migrations from Central Asia in the Middle Ages into Europe. And these migrants, even though they didn't politically conquer Europe or necessarily become the rulers of Europe, apparently had more children, more sons. An analogy might be what you're seeing right now in Europe with all sorts of Middle Eastern refugees arriving, for example, escaping the civil war in Syria. What do Muslim families typically do? They typically have lots of children. That's just part of their culture. Whereas your average European today, who might be, let's say, of Japhetic ancestry, well, nowadays probably of Central Asian ancestry, Semitic ancestry, they tend to be post-Christian, tend to be liberal in a sense, of a liberal worldview, and they don't tend to value children as much. They don't have a lot of children, if they have children at all. And so that sort of cultural phenomena, if played out over multiple generations, can lead to dramatic demographic changes. And even mainstream demographers in Europe right now are talking about this, how in a few generations, if this practice continues, Europe may soon be dominated by people of Middle Eastern descent, simply because the Middle Eastern migrants have more children. I think right now the numbers are anywhere from 5 to maybe 10%, depending on the country, consist of Middle Eastern descent people. But again, you do this sort of multiplicative difference over several generations, and boom, now you suddenly have a dramatic change. That's what played out a few hundred years ago and could be playing out again in Europe right now.
So I want to back up to this whole thing about human DNA's big surprise, because I think some of the discoveries that you have made fill in a lot of the gaps in history. And this book is the most comprehensive, with the color plates. I've just never seen anything like it. This book is just an absolute masterpiece. It's greatness. I have 2 copies sitting right here, and I've already, my other one's already been promised away, and I'm sure I'm going to end up buying 100 of these, where you go through it. You just can't believe what one chart holds. But this book, I can't even fathom what went into writing it. But kind of walk us into this, what people are about to learn today. Take us on this journey with you.
Yeah, the primary focus of the book, if you read it cover to cover, you'll notice is really a basic historical question, but one for which I lacked the answer for decades. I'm not a historian by training. My last history course was in high school, world history, U.S. history, one of the two. I don't remember which one came last in my high school in Wisconsin. But there was something that nagged at me in that course, and probably for many listeners, I think, has nagged at us, because none of us have had this answer for lack of the tools. It's, what's the story of the people? We'll learn often in world history class the political history, the cultural history. If you go to a Christian school, probably the religious history, Reformation, these sorts of things are part of the typical pedagogy. But you don't find out the who. So to give an example, perhaps we'll talk about Rome, because most world history courses these days, if you're in the West, are really histories of Western civilization. So they focus on Greece and Rome and such. Rome will be founded, let's say, 753 BC, or whatever the current number is in mainstream science. And then they'll say Rome occupied the Italian peninsula for several hundred years. They didn't expand too far. Then about the 200s BC, they really started conquering. And by the 100 years after Christ, Rome had dominated almost the entire Mediterranean world, gotten up into Great Britain, modern Great Britain, parts of mainland Europe and such. And then in the 400s AD, there were these invaders from the East, Germanic tribes, as well as the Huns and such, who came and overthrew the Roman Empire. And then you talk about how the Byzantines continue on for another 1,000 years, but eventually get overthrown by the Ottomans in the 1400s. The end. So you have the beginning in the 700s, the end partially in the 400s AD, and then the end in the 1400s. And that's it. And what's missing from all that is the rest of the story. If you think about this from a biblical perspective, you've got the flood, roughly 2500 BC, so about 4,500 years ago, give or take a couple centuries, depending on which chronology you go with. And the Roman people, or the Roman Empire, the Roman political entity, doesn't begin until, what is that, almost 2,000 years after the flood. So who do the Roman people come from? And whoever their ancestors are, what are they doing for these millennia? It's just a big blank sheet. It's a big mystery that is never addressed. And then on top of that, to maybe make things personal, what happens to the Roman people after the empire falls? Modern Italians would surely claim the Roman Empire as their heritage. I mean, most Western people would claim Rome as some sort of cultural ancestor. We think about our political systems and our values and such. We can trace many of those to Rome. But what about genealogical ancestry? Is it legitimate for the Italian people or Italian Americans to claim the ancient Romans as their forebearers? Surely anyone who lives in Italy wants to claim the Roman ruins as their own. In a sense, it belongs to Italy. So, but that question, no one can answer unless you have DNA. Well, you could answer it if you have comprehensive historical records, but those are often few and far between. It's tough to trace your ancestry back even to the 1700s, let's say. I think we've gotten to the 1800s in my case, just unwritten records, but then things tend to disappear. So what do? This is where DNA comes in, and that's really what this book tries to do. It takes 7 civilizations, one from each of the major continents, basically, or cultures, and says, can we find the origin and fate of them? And what I say in the book is we end up telling the story of the whole world. You wouldn't think so, but just the math of human population growth, among other factors, lead to some really crazy outcomes. How just trying to tell the story of Rome, you end up telling the story of much of Europe, or you tell the story of ancient Egypt. Who do they come from? What happened to them? You end up telling the story of much of Africa, including sub-Saharan Africa. So these are the sorts of wild things that emerge. Again, that's the primary focus of the book, but there's so many other surprises that happen along the way. Again, as we already alluded to, you find Noah in this family tree, tracing for each person now, you can trace their ancestry back to a specific son of Noah, or the family line if you're a lady. We've got the line of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, so here's a surprise for me after the book itself was published, or as these videos started coming out, I've had numerous Arabs contact me, either through, we're communicating through Google Translate on social media, or some of them speak English, people from Saudi Arabia, Oman, United Arab Emirates, I don't know about Oman, ancestry from Oman at least, Yemen, Iraq, Kuwait. There's a big debate right now in the Arab community. Who are the true Arabs? And of course, one of the ultimate questions is, which of them go back to Ishmael? Because that's a big item for them. So we have in the family tree Abrahamic descent, which I think is actually through, we have the line of probably the Jews of Judah, perhaps also of Benjamin. With more research, we probably will find some of the other lines of the tribes of Israel, the northern tribes that were conquered by Assyria. We might find the line of Ishmael, but there's all these sorts of things that have emerged. You'll find in this book one of the strongest arguments for the recent history of humanity. It's a strong young Earth argument. It's not primarily an apologetic book, but because it does all this science from a young Earth perspective that works, where you can say, look, here's this history that we know, here's the history in the DNA that you only see through young Earth lens, and on and all these surprises go. So that's just some of the things that people encounter as they go through the book from cover to cover.
Just real quick on that. So with the mutations that you've discovered, I think it's about 3, which each line, it from an older perspective, it doesn't make as much sense. But you take a young perspective with a young chronology, this starts to fill in the blanks. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and if I may, I was going to give the backstory real fast, because I think this plays a big role, especially for people who are trying to do apologetics, or I'm thinking even of parents. At some point, every student, every child decides, well, I'm going to figure out what I believe. And what do they do in today's day of social media and the internet? You can just look up anything you want to. What do the atheists say? And how do we respond to it? So one of the main arguments against young Earth creation for decades, and this is something you'll find in textbooks. So let's say student goes off to secular college. This is what they will hear likely in biology class, or read in the back chapter of the biology book that talks about it. Why isn't creation science? Why should you leave that in church, is what they'll say. And one of the main things they've said is because creationists don't do science. And there's caricature ways of saying this that they've come up with. And there's sort of technical ways they've said this. So the caricature is, they'll say, well, creation scientists, Christians, oversimplify the world. They say, God did it, that settles it. Or God did it, I believe it, that settles it. That's anti-science. How can you make any new discoveries if the Bible answers all your questions? It's not a fair assessment of how the Bible works, but that's what they say. That's how they view creation science. And one of the things they've demanded, and this is sort of the technical side, is, I'll grab my water bottle here that I've got next to me because of my sickness. They'll say gravity is science because it makes predictions. Right now, real time, I've got my grip on this bottle. If I let go, release it, gravity predicts the bottle will fall, which of course it does. They'll say that's why gravity is science, because in theory, we could disprove it. Let's say I released the grip and it started levitating. Now we've got an issue with gravity. Well, what predictions does creation science make? So they'll say, for example, we creationists believe that God created different kinds of creatures 6,000 years ago. Fine. What predictions does that make? How many new species should form this year? Or maybe none should form. Just make some sort of prediction we can experimentally test. What makes this book so exciting is, from an apologetics perspective, is it fulfills predictions that I've put in print years prior. So one of my first books was called Replacing Darwin, published in 2017. a little bit more on the technical side, though I did have a pastor read through it. It does have a secular audience in mind. It's the book I wish I had when I was a student, so that I could take it, give it to my classmates, say, you need to read this. You're an evolutionist, you need to read this. It's 10 chapters of science. It goes through your arguments point by point. It goes through the main arguments against creation science and shows you there's a much better explanation for the origin of species. One of the specific predictions I put in print, which really isn't anything special to me, I mean, any Christian, if you sit and think about it, it makes sense. One of the predictions I put in print is, okay, the Bible says Adam and Eve are the first people created 6,000 years ago. Humanity restarts at the flood with 8 people, Noah, his wife, his sons, and their wives. If all that's true, and if you think about the flood being global and erasing the surface of the earth pre-flood, well, then all civilization is post-flood, and it's all only 4,500 years old, max, roughly speaking. So therefore, if you look at our DNA, you should be able to see the stamps of the history of civilization all over it. Just to give an example, you should see, well, let's pick a historical example. We know the Mongols invaded Europe about 800 years ago, the 1200s AD, and you should expect to see a signature of that because the Mongols, some of them eventually settled down in modern Russia. You should be able to see the influx of East Asian or Mongol type DNA into the European gene pool at that time. And you can see it with the Y chromosome. You should be able to see it that way as well. You get a very different view if you're an evolutionist and you stretch out human history over hundreds of thousands of years. You say modern humans have been around for 200,000, 300,000 years, and civilization is just this tiny tip, the tail end of the history of humanity. You almost wouldn't even think to go looking for it because it would be lost in the statistical noise at the very tip of the Y chromosome family tree. Anyway, long story short, you should be able to see civilization all over our DNA in a way that makes sense. That's essentially what this book is saying. Here it is, all over our DNA. It makes sense. And it makes even more predictions. I've got research going forward from this. I said this is just the beginning. There's all sorts of history still yet to uncover. In a sense, I've got contradictory statements in the book. I say we take a look at 7 civilizations of the world and tell the whole story. We tell the story of about 99% of the people alive today. Now, 95% of us have the same common ancestors just 600 years ago. Much of the really interesting history is in the 1% of the people alive today. That's a whole nother math argument. But my point is the great apologetic value of this book is in the fact that it fulfills predictions. It's doing science. I remember a couple of years ago, as this research was ongoing, there was a pastor who was sort of on the fence when it came to the age of the earth. And we were talking about the history, the pre-Columbian history of the Americas, and how this research makes new discoveries in that realm. And suddenly a light bulb went on for him. He said, oh wow, this isn't just anti-evolutionary sort of negative, this isn't the way the world is, but you're advancing science, you're making new discoveries. And this was just a great boon to him and exciting for him and an eye-opener. That to me is what this book continues to do and will likely lead to in the years going forward.
It's a game changer. It's just astounding. And somebody asked me last night, they said, Frank, are you old Earth? Are you new Earth? And I flop back and forth, over different times. But I told him, I said, I always tend toward young Earth because I think that's where the Bible hermeneutic is found. And, with the 7 days of creation. And so, but then, we're always told, well, this doesn't fit with any science, that you just believing that all by faith against all the evidence. But when I look at this, I think this is a substantial, and it's just going to grow, and it's going to amass into different arguments that people have had that, hey, I believe this whole planet is a lot more recent, than what we think. And I also think too that, and I don't want to offend anybody on here either way, but, just adopting an old Earth philosophy doesn't solve everything, because when you read the Bible, the Earth is created first and later the sun, moon, and stars. And so if that's true, there's a lot of explaining to do. But this book really, I think, fills in a lot of the pieces, because DNA is a new technology that just wasn't available years ago. When I was in high school, we had a murder in our community. It was called the Kentucky Fried Chicken murder. And it was so heinous, they ended up shutting the place down, and all these people were killed, and they had suspects. And it was years later that they actually found the people because of DNA, and they actually had them in jail in a community nearby, and everything was solved by DNA. And also, a person that I went to high school with, he was cleared of a murder. He went to prison for 29 years for murdering his wife. But they had exculpatory evidence that they didn't give him at the time. Might not have cleared him back then, back in the 80s. But when they finally got it, they now had DNA evidence. The Innocence Project, along with Barry Scheck, got involved, and his name's Michael Morton. And they found actually who committed the crime with DNA evidence. The guy confessed to it. Michael was released and received the biggest money settlement in the state of Texas in any case. And now they just recently passed the Michael Morton Act, which has rules about exculpatory evidence. And you can see they've made documentaries on him, The Unreal Dream, that have aired, all because of these developments in DNA. And I think that's what's happening here, that the more we learn about this DNA, the more it's going to point us to God.
Yes. And there's two things that come to mind in response to all that. Start with what you had mentioned at the end there. I was thinking of some of the folks who've written in to me or made comments about the book, and made comments along the lines of, this just seems like seems like a big breakthrough. There's something bigger going on here in this book. It's with human history, but there's something, even if they're not necessarily following everything in it, they can sense there's something bigger going on here that I want to keep my finger on the pulse. The second thing I was going to say was with respect to the age of the earth, that I think is what makes this book even more relevant, especially to pastors, to Christians who are trying to think about this issue. Looking back at the history of the debate over the age of the earth, I echo your points scripturally. What I think this adds scientifically, not just a strong argument for a recent origin of humanity, but one thing it I think presses the point of decision for the old earthers more in the following way. Pre-genetic era, I think you could get away with being old earther, let's say, because you might look at geology and astronomy and say, well, I'm not sure what to do with that. That's technically, it's a lot of math, it's technical. And, but I'm against evolution because you can see gaps in the fossil record, or, basically on the biology side, anti-evolutionary, and I don't have to worry about the age of the earth, but, and I'll just punt a lot of that stuff to geology and astronomy and maybe land old earth that way. My point is, in previous decades, it was plausible in a sense, or easier to try to be anti-evolutionary in biology, maybe agnostic on the age of the earth in biology. And then when you get to geology and astronomy, you say, well, that kind of persuades me I need to be old earth. Where things get trickier now, I think, for the old earther is with the advent of modern genetics. Now you've got clocks, you've got a timescale in biology, and you can't just boil it down to evolution or no evolution. And I've seen this now in old earth creationist organizations like Reasons to Believe. What do you do with Adam? Where do you put Adam and Eve? Well, how do you explain the genetic data from two people? There's an inherent timescale component you can't ignore anymore. And of course, that's a fundamental issue that I think many would have agreed on in times past, would still agree on now, even if they're old earth. Well, of course, Adam and Eve are real. Well, now you've got a whole new data set that you've got to wrestle with, that has a timescale component to it, that has a population size component to it. So I think it presses all the more, once again, hey, you have to make a decision on the age of the earth. Now you have to make it in the realm of biology as well. And there's some pretty big consequences for whatever you decide. Excuse me.
Yeah, you get into Genesis and you start to learn something like this and say, well, okay, now all of a sudden, do we have a new Adam and Eve naming really old animals, that have been around way before them? And that might be a bit of a stretch when we look at the order of creation and who was made when.
Yes, and that's a good point. I hadn't thought through. I appreciate that. Naming animals that have been around quite some time.
Okay, well, give us a good takeaway here as we're getting toward the end of the show about, what do we need to take away from this? And then we'll talk about where to get the book and such.
Yeah, there's several things I'd say that I think are relevant to each listener. So first of all, I'd say this is the first book that gives us the history of peoples. And again, this is the beginning of this endeavor. There's a lot more that'll be uncovered. And the answers are in all of us. They're in our DNA. And as people contribute their DNA or have their own DNA tests done, there's even more history that's going to emerge. Second thing is there's a lot of prehistory, so-called prehistory, pre-written records. I'm thinking of like pre-Columbian Americas. Some of the most explosive research in this book is how it dramatically changes the mainstream understanding of the Americas. There's been multiple settlings of the Americas before Europeans arrived. There's just all sorts of stuff that emerges there. Pre-European Africa, pre-European Pacific, all sorts of things emerge. We've got Noah in the tree. You can trace your ancestry back to Noah. We've got the lines of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the tree. We can see the genealogical record of that. You've got, I didn't mention this, but there's really big relevance to the whole debate over race and ethnicity. What this book shows is that the so-called races have changed multiple times in human history. There are light-skinned, pale-faced people who've had olive-skinned Arab ancestors going back maybe 1,000 years, and those olive-skinned Arabs had dark-skinned Sudanese ancestors before them. There's just all sorts of things where you say, no way, that's crazy, but that's what emerges from this family tree. There is relevance to missions, so especially for pastors or missionaries who are listening. One of the things that's so exciting about all this to me is now you can trace a whole people group. New Guinea, who do these people come from? I can tell you many of them trace their ancestry back to a specific son of Joktan. When I told this to a Bible translator, he said, this is exciting. Our first step, of course, is giving the people the scriptures in their own language. The second step is Bible engagement. And so to be able to say, hey, look, this is where your story starts. And by the way, there's many indigenous accounts of their own history that find an echo in this Y chromosome tree. So if you're thinking about apologetics in indigenous settings, there's ways to say, hey, well, look, we've got the echo of what your history is, and we can connect it back to specific men in Genesis 10. And his comment was, here's a way where we can address a question that comes up, let's say in New Guinea. This translator was a light-skinned guy like me. He said, we can go to these people and say, look, this is your story. This isn't just a white man's book, which is apparently what he's probably heard before. This book talks about your people here. Your ancestors are found in this book. We could say that in a general sense, of course, before genetics with Genesis 10. Now we can say it specifically as well. So there's a whole field there of relevance to missions, of relevance to indigenous accounts, giving people back their history. I've been talking with a gentleman who's part of the Hmong people. They're sort of a people without a nation right now. Many of them are in China. The Chinese are trying to make everyone Han Chinese and erasing, in a sense, the indigenous accounts. There's echoes of their history in the Y chromosome tree. So to be able to give people back their history is exciting, satisfying. There's a very strong, one of the strongest arguments in print for the recent origin of humanity in this book traced. And last point I'd say that is a real big take home. In Answers in Genesis, we talk about biblical authority, starting with the scriptures and viewing the world through the lens of the Bible instead of letting mainstream science reinterpret the scriptures for us and doing damage to it, doing damage to the gospel and so forth. So we've talked a lot about defending biblical authority. I would go so far to say that this book doesn't just defend biblical authority, it puts biblical authority on offense. Creationists are now taking the lead in multiple fields of science now in history and answering questions no one's had access to before. So that's something really exciting for me. I think it'd be really exciting for any students listening. What do you want to do with your life? There's some really big Sherlock Holmes, Indiana Jones type things left to do in the realm of genetics and history. So I consider it a great privilege to be able to be part of this. And there's just tons more left to do. So thinking of those who are still up and coming and deciding on careers, there's some fantastic opportunities waiting for those who take the Bible plainly and want to understand our world better.
You know, those of you that are listening, I mean, I'm convinced that you are a rock star. You are Elvis, man. I mean, this stuff is just absolutely phenomenal. I think it's going to lead to other breakthroughs. In fact, I'm going to put in a request and take a little liberty here. So one of the things that, I think everybody's curious about and is the longer lifespans that are found. Adam and Eve are living over 900 years and different things. And there's different things. And I've always wondered, if some breakthroughs might eventually come in this DNA area, particularly in the fact that when you look at animals, almost all animals can make their own vitamin C. Our dogs can, our cats can, rabbits can, especially goats. Goats make so much that, if a goat gets sick, they say, don't even take it to the vet. It's going to die. Because goats, they make so much, they can just basically eat anything and overcome it. But guinea pigs don't have it. And that's one of the reasons they use them for experiments. But human beings do not make their own vitamin C. But it's my understanding that we have this in our DNA, but it's turned off. And I'm just like, I've just been waiting for someone like you to come along and to figure out some of this and speak to some of this. And I know you probably don't have anything now, but I hope this will someday be one of your books. But I think we might see breakthroughs in that, from the, Abraham lives 175 years and we just have, a dipping off from the flood. And then, from, when Peleg was born, the continent splitting, and without, great explanations for how this happened. So do you think we'll see anything emerge from this field in that?
There's two things that come to mind along those lines. One specific to, actually three things. I want to address the vitamin C, the lifespans, and then the larger question of health and discovering disease cures, understanding disease, and how origins plays a role in that. So with respect to vitamin C, I want to think I'm fuzzy on the details. It's been a while since I've looked at this. I want to think that the current view is that we have a gene, but it may be broken or there's some sort of pseudogene. Whatever it is, there's been a lot of errors made on the part of the mainstream community because they view our DNA through the lens of evolution. And they're expecting our DNA to be littered with errors. And we've come almost completely full circle. So when the human DNA, the human genome was announced, published 2001, I think it was Bill Clinton, Francis Collins, and I forget the last guy's name, but made an announcement, we've solved the DNA, which was most of our DNA at that time. They said it's filled with junk. Mainstream community said it was filled with junk, leftovers of evolution, millions of years of mistakes and copying errors. Well, that was 2001. 2012, they announced the results of a project called the ENCODE project. It was an acronym that the specifics I forget of, but basically they were taking biochemical tools to our DNA piece by piece to try to figure out if there's any evidence for function. So again, 95% they would say it was junk. 2001. 2012, they say almost the complete opposite. They say there's biochemical evidence, preliminary biochemical evidence for function in 80% of our DNA. So that's almost a complete 180. And again, this is just biochemical evidence. There wasn't genetic testing to try to knock out pieces of DNA. That was just the tip of the iceberg, basically. So I'm saying supposedly our vitamin C gene is broken, I think is the current view. And I take that with a grain of salt. I have to go back and look at the evidence. It's probably doing something. Yes, we do need vitamin C supplements. But it would take someone to go back and look and say, did it used to be different? And that's something I'd be curious about. I don't know the answer yet, but yes, that would be worthy of digging into further and saying, did the, excuse me, did our ancestors once have the ability to make vitamin C? How was it that they were different? Which leads me then to the second question, lifespans. What caused lifespans? There's been two major views in the creationist circles as to what led to that. And they all hovered around about 900. If you graph, people have done this, of course, nerds have done this, graphed out the lifespans, and they all hover roughly around 900 years long in Genesis 5. And then they drop off in an almost exponential decay curve in Genesis 11. And that has led some to suggest perhaps there was some sort of genetic factor that decreased lifespan. There was essentially a genetic bottleneck at the flood, wherein we may have lost some of the pre-flood genetic diversity, and we may have also concentrated some of the pre-flood mutations in some of these peoples before they then migrated out after Babel. So genetic corruption has been one idea as to why lifespans dropped off. There's also from the fossil record at least, appears to have been a dramatic change in the environment. The pre-flood plants, the pre-flood atmosphere and such is probably different, perhaps more conducive. Could that have played a role? I don't know yet the answer, if it's either or it might be both and. The third thing I want to say that's, I think, relevant to all of this is, when I was in graduate school, people would often talk about, and I was working on stem cells, adult stem cells, which are the cells that maintain our bodies, keep the bloodstream going, that sort of thing. And of course, there's opportunities for human health, but in the field of disease research, genetics was often invoked as a causal explanation. I viewed it as over-invoked as a causal explanation. It seemed like if we didn't have a better explanation, we just chalked it up to genetics. So I would hear people say, yeah, this is a genetic disease. I'm like, you just don't have an explanation, so you invoke this as the latest thing. My thinking has changed now in the last 12 years of creation science, looking at the amount of mutations that's accumulated in our DNA, being able to now model this and chart them from beginning to end. And I've now begun to wonder if, in fact, we are perhaps at a threshold, a genetic threshold at this stage of human history, where, again, God creates Adam and Eve with perfect DNA. Each of them have 2 copies. Oftentimes, so we all have all sorts of mutations, mistakes in our DNA, but usually we have it because we have different parents, still a good version that compensates. Well, are we now at a stage where enough mutations have accumulated where we're sort of running out of good copies, or they're just too many to cover? So what I initially poo-pooed as genetics is the lack of a good explanation, I'm now wondering if, in fact, there's some merit to this. And just to put things perhaps from another perspective, at Answers in Genesis, we've often talked about origin science versus operational science, questions of the past versus questions of the present. You know, how do we cure this disease versus how did this disease arise, or how did this species arise? And we've often distinguished them, separated them as separate domains, which is a fair practice. But I've now begun to wonder if there's more of a marriage that needs to be made, given the amount of data we have and understanding we have about our genetics from a creationist perspective, and how this can lead to very different expectations about whether this DNA piece is a mutation, whether it's functional or not. It looks like, to my surprise, having grown up with this dichotomy, distinction, it does look like one's origins views do play a role in how we understand the origin of disease. And so there's a real opportunity here as well, thinking again of any students or others who might be listening, parents who have students, of reevaluating our understanding of current diseases and their causes from a young earth creationist perspective, and the perspective of where these differences among us come from. Again, not looking at it through the lens of everything's a mistake ultimately because of evolution, but no, there's a whole bunch that was created. In fact, I would say the vast majority of the differences among us are due to creation and Adam and Eve, not due to mutation, and minority are mutation. And so that's a whole big data set to tackle. But I think there's some real opportunity here, and perhaps some paradigm shifts and revolutions in medicine that could occur once you look at the data through the lens of Scripture and that timescale and the ramifications from it in genetics. And I'm excited to see where that goes.
I'm excited too, because I think that hopefully there'll be some others that will join you in this endeavor, in this field. And for decades now, I've been teaching in, worldview conferences and stuff, and even came to Wisconsin back in the 90s. So I was just listening to your thing. Maybe you even saw me maybe back in the day. I would love to have had some take any credit for anything that you have become, because you're amazing. Well, we run out of time in the show. So would you tell us how we can get this book, how we can learn more videos, come see you at the museum? Tell us everything real quick.
Yeah. So the book we had on our shelves middle of March, and it sold out within a couple of weeks, I think, which I was pleased to see. Some of that is the constraints of printing in the COVID era. Yes. But we have the second printing, and I think there's maybe even a third printing going on right now because of, everyone's affected now, book publishers, printers, all there's delays. So we're expecting perhaps third week of June for it to be in. We are taking pre-orders. You can get it Answers from Genesis through our web store, or you can call in customer service. You can order on Amazon. Amazon, I think, takes effectively the form of pre-orders. The publisher, Master Books, I think is doing that as well. So you can find it in multiple locations online, or like I said, you can call in, or if you come to the Creation Museum here at Ark Encounter, if we have it in stock, you can get it here as well. I do have an agreement with the customer service. Our offices here are at the Creation Museum in Kentucky. I said if people buy books, they want a signature, just call me up if I'm in the office or not sick. I'll be happy to step out and sign them. So there's a way to get a signed copy. Though I also have another agreement with customer service. People call in, they order the book. Again, you can pre-order through Answers in Genesis, pre-order the second printing, and you say, I want my book signed. You just, at the time you call in, again, probably not through web ordering, but if you call into customer service and say, I'd like this book and I want it signed, they will make a note in that order, and they'll come to me and say, hey, you've got these 5 books or whatever to be signed. There's a way for that as well. If you get the book and you go to Appendix A, you want to participate in future research, or you've got a question about your genetic testing results, it's got the website. Or even if you don't get the book, you can just go to answersingenesis.org/go/trace the title. There's a way to participate in future research. There's a place to submit, say, hey, I got a result from 23andMe and it doesn't seem to line up with what's in the book. Each company often has their own unique way of reporting results. So I'm happy that it takes me 10 seconds to figure out what that means. I can tell you what that means practically in terms of which son of Noah, what the in-between history is. All that is a great way for us to keep in touch. Like I said, this is likely going to go on for the rest of my life, Lord willing. I'm grateful for the opportunity to do it, for the Lord's enabling, and give him the glory for it. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk about it on your show as well, Frank. So thank you.
I love this man and his ministry and everything that's going on. You'll hear more, because I think there's just going to be more exciting developments should Jesus tarry, and just exciting stuff. And we want to thank you for being a part of this episode of Defending the Faith. Be sure and share this with somebody. This is faith building material, and you can change somebody's life. And who knows, you might give this to a young person and they might become the next great scientist that joins Dr. Jeanson in showing people that God is real and that Christianity is the truth. Well, God bless you, and we will see you in the next episode of Defending the Faith.